Today, we're going to have a slightly different format. We're going with a Q&A session. And it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Blow. Jonathan Blow is an American video game designer and programmer who is best known as the creator of the independent video games Braid of 2008 and The Witness of 2016, both of which have received critical acclaim. From 2001 to 2004, Blow wrote the Inner Product column for Game Developer magazine. He was the primary host for the experimental gameplay workshop at the Game Developers Conference, which has become a premier showcase for new ideas in video games. In addition, Blow was a regular participant in the Indie Game Jam, and Blow is also a founding partner of the Indie Fund, an angel investor fund for independent game projects. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Blow. So, John studied computer science pretty close in Berkeley. What was it like with a passion for game development studying in university?
Not that good, actually. It was a different time. So there was, I was just saying this over in the corner, there was nothing in school, almost nothing remotely applicable to game development, right? There was one computer graphics class, and that was it, right? Everything else was computer science. This was, 1989 to 93 or 94, so it's probably before most people's birthdays here, I guess.
And were you building video games at that time, or did that come later?
I did. I mean, I started programming when I was a kid, like around 10 years old, maybe 11, something like that. And I started by making little hobby games, and then they got more sophisticated over time. And then there was maybe a break from that when I was in college for the first couple of years when I was like being all serious about school. And then eventually I switched back to spending a lot of my time on my own projects. Yeah.
What kind of tools were you using at that time? So we have a lot of first-time game developers in our class, and we're introducing them to Unity, which is a bit more higher level than, I guess, the C architecture used to. What was it like, I guess, trying to use these more, let's say, rudimentary tools as a developer then?
There was no such a thing as a tool to make games with at that time. Really nothing. So you were just programming in C or some other language. Like back then, everybody liked making domain-specific languages. So you might make a programming language that you thought was better to make games in, and then make the game using that. And I think ultimately that's been shown to be a misguided approach. But that was what people did.
So in learning your fundamentals at university, is there anything you wish perhaps a mentor at the time had told you, knowing that you would be pursuing games, or even maybe some advice which you wish you hadn't taken?
I'm sure there are many things. The problem is coming up with something coherent, because what happened, so you're in school, you learned a bunch of stuff, and you probably brought some computer knowledge in with you beforehand. And by the time you're toward the end of school, you're like, yeah, I know a lot, right? I'm really good at this or something. And now I'm going to go do stuff in the real world. And the actual thing is like, here's nothing on some graph. And here's kind of how much you are able to learn within a 4-year time span at school, even if you work really hard. And here's what is actually required to be competent at this domain, right? So it's like a huge leap that you have to go from here to there, right? And it's not a leap that is makeable instantly, right? It requires more years of hard work. And something about seeing that clearly would have been helpful, I think.
Yeah.
It would have helped me attack that in a more orderly fashion and make less of a mess.
When you talk about maybe the delta between what you've learned in school and what you're going to need to succeed in the games industry, what are the resources where you see people picking up that information?
I don't know that there's an organized resource. I mean, on the internet today, there's just tons of information, right? The problem is 97% of it is bad advice, and 3% of it is like really good advice. And I don't necessarily know how you're supposed to know which 3% is the right 3%. Certainly it's true that anyone writing a column on the internet about how to make games the right way probably isn't quite the right person to listen to, right? They're not the worst person to listen to, but they're the person who has enough time to write a column on the internet about how you should make games, which by definition, all the people who are at the edge of the envelope of high skill and all this stuff are busy. They've all got more to do than they can possibly do, right? And so they might kick out a little thing once in a while, like I made a little blog post today for the first time in 3 years about this thing that I did, right? But they're not going to be writing organized advice, and that's a little bit of a problem, I think. But I don't know how to solve that.
So one of the resources we're using are YouTube tutorials and kind of online resources to learn how to build our early prototypes. And you're speaking on behalf, you helped to found, right, the Experimental Game Workshop at GDC.
Sure.
Is GDC, you think, maybe fulfilling that gap and providing that kind of intermediary resource?
I think it's super good, for people starting out, because you just go there and you get a lot of context about what's happening. You see all the things that people are working on. You see in the talks how they think about the problem they're working on, right? Oftentimes, you may not think much of the way they're approaching the problem even. Sometimes that'll be because you don't have enough experience yet to know why, but sometimes it'll be because they just really aren't approaching it well. I mean, the funny thing about games, and not just games, but I'm going to extend this to the technology industry broadly, is that there's this very weird phenomenon that happens. Like if you think about how capitalism is supposed to work, then if someone's very successful in making a lot of money, it should be because they're good at what they do, right? And they succeed and so forth, right? That's true in getting over some initial hump of starting a company, but after that, there's this inverse process that happens where the bigger a company is, the more money they have to spend on their projects, and the more money they have to spend on their projects, the more they can afford to screw up and do things badly and still drag themselves over whatever the minimum bar is to release something, right? And so I'm not going to mention any companies like Facebook or Twitter or anybody like that, but I mean, you look at all these companies and that's literally what's happening, right? Twitter is the most canonical example of that because they hardly do anything. And they spend so much money hardly doing anything. But there's and that's not just to, I don't wish to say that just to bash on individual companies because I've observed it as a general technology phenomenon. And so if you look at a bigger game company and you think, Electronic Arts or Activision or somebody like that is very successful and therefore that's the model that I should follow. Really within that company, there's like a small percentage of people who are the most talented and know how to do everything. And those people are putting out fires all the time. And they're not responsible for most of what is produced by that company because they can't be by sheer numbers, right? And so most of what the larger companies produce is not that well produced. And so therefore, if you go to a conference and many, the speeches that you see are going to be random samples that were chosen from the conference, mostly based on like, oh, that's an interesting game that people want to hear about. And this person worked on a piece of it and therefore, et cetera, right? And so it meets some minimum bar of, hey, the game existed and it came out and people liked it. So there is some amount of reality that the approach that person took was good, but beyond that, you can't infer much. Like it could be, I don't know. Hopefully this makes enough sense.
Sure,
that I can just
yeah.
stop talking.
So on the topic of prototyping, you mentioned how perhaps some companies start going in the wrong direction and then eventually get dragged that way. What can even our student teams do to evaluate what features, what design decisions might need changing? How do we determine what's going to be a prototype turned into a feature, and then what maybe is going to die as a prototype? We need a pivot.
It's a little bit hard to make generalizations that are accurate everywhere, but I can make some, right? The thing that I would say that's the biggest mistake that people tend to make early on is, they come up with some idea about how a game's going to work or some piece of it and why it's going to be interesting. And they'll build these elaborate theories about why it's interesting, right? Because, oh, the player has to think about this and then that's what makes this interesting or whatever. And then you get it running and it's not interesting. And in fact, when the player has to this and and all these elaborate theories that you had, that ends up just being a big drag that nobody really wants to play. Very common, right? Now, at that point, you have a choice of removing the thing, changing it fundamentally, or proceeding onward and hoping it gets better, right? Or there's a middle one in between those last two of giving lip service to the fact that you're going to change this thing and make it better, but then you change it in tiny incremental ways that don't really matter and don't solve the real problem, right? Because people just don't fundamentally want to face reality. They don't want to admit that their elaborate theory about why this thing was going to be good, they don't want to admit that that may be wrong, because what is that then? There's whole personality judgments that can land on them as a result of that. Oh, maybe I wasn't as smart of a designer as I thought I was or something, right? So the main advice that I can say is don't do that third thing, right? Don't ignore the fact that something doesn't work and just say, oh, we'll make the graphics better, it'll work later, or, the frame rate's a little bit low, but we'll do something to make it run faster and then it'll be fine. It's like, not really. If it's not good to start with, it probably won't magically get good.
Could you break down for us what your process is? What does prototyping at Thekla look like? And then at what stage?
We don't do that. I mean, so the thing you have to understand about, it's not completely true, but
okay.
The thing about my current company is we're small. We're about 10 people. And we work on big, difficult projects. So our last game took 6 years. There's not a lot of prototyping going on when it takes you 6 years to finish something, right? I mean, we started with something that I put together by myself. It was a very simple, like, oh, you walk around and you can do this and do that. And then we just sort of built that up. The same thing, there's a game we haven't announced that I did. We'll release it eventually, but I started on it a few years ago. And you could say it was prototyped, but actually, the sense in which it was a prototype is just that the graphics were super ugly and they're just 2D sprites, and I didn't care that much about that. But I started building the real gameplay from day one, right? And tried to build it into a real game along all the other axes from day one. So I don't know. I almost would say this is a weird thing that my opinion has changed on over the years. Like, I've given speeches about prototyping and how to do it well. That was a long time ago. These days, I don't really prototype. I follow some path that leads incrementally toward a complete game. Whereas I feel like prototype is more a thought experiment, and then maybe we build this into something, or I don't know. So I do a different thing. But I think when you're at the student stage, prototyping is actually probably a good thing because it gives you experience fast. So I don't want to discourage that. I just want to say, though, the long-term career arc maybe involves you getting skilled enough that you don't really need to prototype a bunch of random ideas to get started on something that'll really work. But that's T plus 12 to 14 years. That's not when you start, because it's hard. Design is hard, and programming is hard, and yeah.
So The Witness is a game based around a pretty simple core mechanic of drawing lines between things. And we recently completed an assignment which was just completely based around juicing one core mechanic. It's interesting, though, because that mechanic looks eerily similar to one in a previous prototype, the game with the spells. And I'm interested in how maybe your process allows for those kind of core ideas to bubble up and maybe move to the side ideas that aren't pivotal to the success of the game.
So there's something a little bit misleading there, right? So the core activity that you do in The Witness, the core the verb that the game is based around. I don't usually talk in this language, but it's, I think, necessary to clarify this. The verb in the game, the thing that you choose to do as a player, is to draw lines in puzzles and stuff. But that's not the core mechanic, right? The core mechanic is that you're stuck on something. It's much more abstract. It's that you're stuck on something that you don't understand, and your lack of understanding is happening because you're assuming more things than you needed to. And then you have a sudden stroke of insight out of some magical place that tells you the answer or gives you an exciting thing to try, and then you execute that attempted solution with that verb, right? So if it was actually just a game about drawing lines, I don't think it would be that interesting, right? So in designing the game, it's like, okay, this line drawing thing is how we make this other thing happen, but it's only in service of the other thing. And so most of the thought that goes into the design is at a more abstract level, right? So the thing is, if you were to try to prototype a game like The Witness by sitting down and saying, I'm going to make a cool game where you draw lines in puzzles, and if that's what you prototype, then you're not going to get anything that interesting. So it's a subtle business. But you need to program the thing about drawing the lines or something like that in order to build the scaffolding for this actual interesting thing to be able to happen. But that scaffolding doesn't succeed if the interesting, subtle thing doesn't happen or isn't interesting or subtle, right? So the problem with this is that I can't necessarily map it onto anyone's individual project, right? Because hopefully, you know, like, hey, I want to make a game about a guy that jumps and he can grab balloons sometimes and float for a while, right? Okay, that's fine. But like, why, right? There's got to be a why, or it's just a very empty exercise, right? And so the thing that keeps your idea about, I mean, I don't use this term game mechanic very often, even because I don't like the popular understanding of mechanic that has arisen, but I'm going to use it anyway here. But I don't ever think about mechanics when I design, or not usually. But if you call this jumping and grabbing balloons thing a mechanic, there's many ways for that prototype to fail, right? The most obvious way is like, well, we just never managed to do the programming well enough that he could grab the balloon or something, right? But that's a relatively pedestrian and uninteresting way to fail that you should be able to get past before too long. But then the real way to fail is just like, well, I grabbed the balloon and then I let go, and I don't know what this is about or how to make it better. I don't know how to make it better because I don't know what it's for, because I don't know why people would play it, right? So to go beyond the very basic, you need to know where to aim, and to know where to aim, you need to know why that's a thing. And very often, now the thing is, almost everybody who has some idea like that has a little bit of a grip on why, and they don't even know it, right? Like there's something, you know, if that really excited you, like the idea of grabbing on a balloon and floating up or something, there's something about that, there's something about the way that that makes you feel, or something that it reminds you of, that made you have that idea in the first place, probably, unless you played this game of like throwing pieces of paper in a hat and pulling them out, which people do sometimes. But you know, so then the job is just understanding why you were interested in that in the first place, and that's actually not very easy. But none of this is easy. So
you might then describe this kind of jumping to grab the balloons as the mechanic, but it's not the subtle purpose. It's not the higher purpose. If you don't find that purpose through prototyping, what inspired you to make these games? How did you find what you might call the abstract mechanic?
Well, so that happened in different ways on the previous two games.
Sure, maybe you could speak to your experience.
So for The Witness, it actually, that whole thing about having a sudden realization about what was important came from that previous spellcasting game. And it was like, while I was designing the spellcasting game that I thought was about navigating a multi-parameter space in your head to like concoct the right magic spell or whatever, and it was too hard to play. You know, I had this idea about something in the game that was going to be really cool about you realize the significance of something, and I just felt really big to realize that, right? And for various reasons of unplayability, I never took that game very far. But that one piece really stuck with me. And so I said, well, I'm going to build a game around that, right? Previous game, Braid, was really a little different. There was an initial exploration on that game that was something like what people do when they prototype. I said, well, you know, I'm going to make a platformer, and it's going to be about taking these ideas that happen in quantum mechanics that are weird, like, you know, about things being in superposition, or about, you know, the arrow of time actually being bidirectional, and forward time being some kind of a mirage or something. And it was going to be about illustrating all those things. And then what happened was I started doing like one of them, and realized that was, I just started messing with time and realized that was enough to build a whole game around, right? And then I just dropped everything else. Not totally, because the ending of the game brings back the bidirectional arrow of time thing and stuff. But so that was more like prototyping, but then interestingly the function of the prototyping was just to get into a space where I could find something that was different from the idea that I started with, and then could run with, you know. So that's the thing is you know you're actually successful in that kind of endeavor when you get something that's better than the idea that you started with, and you get to drop that idea in favor of this thing that's even more exciting, right? Because if you don't ever get to do that, if it's like, oh, I had this idea and I'm scraping by just trying to make this thing that implements it, and it doesn't implement it very well, but someday it'll get as good as the vision in my head, that's kind of a slog, right? You know you're in good territory when you exceed the original idea and you can drop the original idea, which actually happened for The Witness too, at a slightly different magnitude. Now, I don't know if that can happen in a semester class, but because it's not quite long enough. But just to keep your eyes open, and there's a skill of noticing what is really good about the thing that you're making. I'm just beating on this theme again from different directions, but like everybody's super attached to their thing, right? And if you can really be honest to yourself about what's good about it and what's not good about it, that skill develops over time, and you get better at it. And that's one of the most important skills you could have, actually.
When, through your work for the Indie Fund, you're looking at some games which are really successful and others which don't quite make it there, what's kind of the big thing in the way of preventing these games from succeeding? Do you notice any patterns?
What kind of success? Do you mean financial success or creative success, or where because it can be very different answers.
Sure, I'm interested in both. So when it comes to, let's say, creative success,
yeah,
does it vary by how the creator defines it, or how would you explore that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that creative success is highly subjective, but I can draw a somewhat objective distinction of there's some kinds of projects that people come on and we give them money to make them, and they never really congeal into a thing that makes sense. And I think I can tie that back to my original, or not my original point, but the thing I was saying about knowing why your game idea is that game idea and what it's trying to be. Because I think it's not that uncommon that people don't really know the answer to that, or they can give you some answer, but it's a very surface answer. And those projects often tend to derail because either things don't quite go as they expected, and then they don't know how to course correct because they don't know where they're going, so how can you course correct? Or even if things don't explicitly derail, they just get hard. Like it's a really large amount of work to make a full game, like really large. And there's some point where you just end up in the middle of the desert and you can't remember what life was like back when you started, and you can't see the end of it because there's just more things on your to-do list. Your to-do list grows every day, right? It doesn't ever shrink, so you can't plot some date in the future when the to-do list will be gone because it monotonically increases, right? So there's this point where you're just stuck. You're not stuck because you're making progress every day, but the progress doesn't appear to be going anywhere. And at that point, you need to know why you're making this thing, or stuff falls apart. And that's really common
And so
among projects that have problems.
if they can't see ahead, is that sort of your role to go in and help identify those problems? Or do you feel
Yeah, I mean, we try to do that, but the problem is nobody ever listens. Like, seriously, nobody, even on more trivial advice. So let's take the most rudimentary piece of advice ever. Like, people are about to launch their game. They have their launch plan. It's like, all right, we're going to launch in 1 month. And I say to them, nobody's heard of your game. If you launch it right now, nobody's going to buy it. And then you'll be broke and you'll have to go get a job rather than continuing on as an independent developer. I have said in very clear terms to teams on at least 6 occasions, you cannot follow this plan because it will have the following result. You must take more time and do something out of the box to publicize your game, right? So purely business advice about a factual thing, nothing subjective about what you're making that people might have issue with or anything. Not a single time has that advice been heeded. At all. Never. Nobody listens to it, and then the games come out and they fall on the floor, right? So if people won't even take advice about things that are that simple, they really won't take advice about difficult stuff like, what's your game about or something, right? So I don't know.
So maybe as game developers, we're a little resistant to people coming in and changing
it's just human
the vision
beings.
on us.
I don't even think it's game developers. It's human beings. The problem is I don't. I don't know what to do about that. It's like
what would be your advice, I guess, to students who might receive, let's say, critique or feedback for the first time? Is there any way to kind of take what John Blow is saying to you and take it to heart a little, without getting emotions
So you mean like
in the
direct
way?
feedback about a game?
Yeah.
Like if I sat down and played the game and then
Right.
said something. I think, again, keep in mind that you're working on your long-term skill in design, in observing your game, in programming, right, in whatever. And stuff that you do right now is probably mainly practice. And because the goal is to get better, then if you identify something that's wrong, that's good because it moved you a little bit further toward the goal, right? You may still disagree with somebody's feedback, right? But you don't have to take it super emotionally like that. Because it's useful. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't care about what you made. You should care about what you made. But again, it's the dynamic range of how high your skill can get compared to where it is right now is very high. And you should be trying to get up there. And to get up there, well, I don't know. I mean, if you're already good enough, then, which I don't want to presuppose that nobody is, but I doubt it because it's so hard, right? If you were, hypothetically, already at top skill level, then, then you'll still find plenty of people who tell you they don't like your thing anyway. So and they'll tell you all these specific problems with it that you will disagree with, right? I do that all the time. The problem is when you're not that experienced, you'll have the same kind of reasons, but they won't be as well founded. So you want to develop your skill in creation faster than your skill in argumentation. Because if you become a better arguer than you become at making games, then you'll always argue your way out of it and then never, I don't know. Rambling, doesn't matter.
All right, so we're going to go to student questions.
Yeah.
Let's have If anybody has a question, please raise a hand, and I'll just repeat it out. Yes.
This comes a little bit out of the game I'm looking at. It seems like whenever I ask a game developer about how do you understand the way that different players are going to interact with each other, they try to answer it and really end up just saying, I have no idea. And I know that all the games that you've designed, at least that I know of, are single-player games.
Yeah.
But lots of people who play The Witness play it in groups because it's too difficult for them to do on their own. I'm wondering if you have a way of thinking about not only the player experience, but how the game encourages people to interact together.
I'll just repeat that. Okay, so the question is, how can we proactively make our games work well for multiple players or social experiences?
So it's a very different thing for a multiplayer game than a single-player game, right? As you sort of said in the question. And that's important to keep in mind, right? Like, you can say that there's a thing called video game design, but there's a whole lot of different compartments in that space or something, right? And many of the techniques that I thought of, or that I used when building The Witness would not apply at all to a multiplayer game because they're, well, I mean, the special case of two people playing it in front of one screen is still like a single-player game in that there's one thing happening in the world, right? Whereas if you're talking about an asynchronous multiplayer thing where like people are just running around and they each have their own view, it's a very different thing to design for. But if you're going to design that kind of game, yes, I agree or I agree with what you implied, which is that the answer that people have to that question of like, I don't know, they're going to do whatever they do, is not a good answer, right? You have to know that. An analogy would come from architecture, right? If you are going to be a professional architect and you start to design a building, and then somebody asks you, well, what are people going to do in the building? And you say, I don't know, right? It's not going to be a very good building. Because, you know, and a good architect cannot just answer that at a high level. They won't just say, you know, it's the classroom building with a lecture hall in it. They'll say things like, well, it's going to be common for people to come from the central rear thing down the hallway, and so out the front door on the opposite end of the building, we want this view framed, right? And we want to think about what direction the light's coming and during what seasons, and like, they think about that super intensely. And a lot of that is not things that are guaranteed going to happen. It's just like, well, when people are going through the space in certain ways, we want to think about that. We want to accommodate what's going to happen there, and we want to make the result good. Yeah, I mean, we'll drop that there, but we'll just say that should be all you're thinking about if you're making a multiplayer game, right? So if someone can't talk to you, okay, the other thing about a multiplayer game is they're generally designed for people to play for a long time, right? They're generally designed for more hours of play than a single player game. And so you have to have that much more of an idea about what's going to happen. You have to have enough more of an idea to provide 200 or 1,000 hours of play or something. I mean, unless it's a museum game or something like that. And so if somebody can't talk to you for at least 8 hours straight about what would happen in their game when players interact, they don't have enough of an idea for someone to play something for 1,000 hours. Like, it's just not there. So, I don't know.
So on your current project, in creating a new language, a lot of the work is just going into building out the infrastructure to support it. For example, you built like a sort of PowerPoint and et cetera, other programs like that. Do you feel like the onus is on us as developers to create all the tools with which to, let's say, experience the game? Because I see a lot of developers now who are developing, let's say, social features, like trying to integrate with Twitch and things like that.
I mean, again, it's easy to spend a lot of time doing that kind of stuff if you don't have something better to do, right? which is not, it's not a complete negative. Like, okay, hey, we integrated with Twitch and that helps in some way, probably. Probably doesn't help the gameplay that much. It might help get you more people or something, like something pragmatic like that. But yeah, there's this thing, I mean, people get into this cycle of like, making a game means building a thing that looks like what I understand a game to look like. So they like mimic the outer shell of a game. And that's where you start getting too much of that kind of thing. You know, like, oh, we did Twitch integration and like, I don't know, like, hey, I'm building a multiplayer game, so I have a lobby and a chat system and an away button and spectation and all these things. And then it's like, well, you ask them, what's the actual game? And it's like, well, you play tic-tac-toe or something. And it's like not, you know, it's not there. So it's very common, again. And because especially in a class like this, the amount of time you have to work on things is not very long. You know, school year might seem long, right, or semester might seem long, but relative to the scale of a game that you might make, it's a short time. So you want to be careful about that and put effort where it's going to actually be useful.
Okay,
No.
the question being, do you see AAA studios in the future making what we've known to call an indie title?
I mean, it depends a little bit on what is, you know, what is the feature that you're identifying of those games, right? But given that I assume I can broadly presume what you mean without us blabbing for 10 minutes to try and nail it down. The problem is just, it's not what most people want. Quite plain spokenly, right? It's the same, you know, what movies have the high budgets? It's like Transformers 4 or 5. Which one? Is it 5 that just came out? I don't even know, right? Pacific Rim 2 or whatever. Like, it's things that are not exactly the movies made by people who are thinking deeply about what it means to be a human being or something like that. And you see this pattern in most places. It's a little bit different in books, simply because writing a book doesn't require a high budget usually. So you can get books by individuals that are mega hits, but most of these other forms are not like that. And so, you know, Electronic Arts, being a large company, they don't care about a game, you know, with the budget of The Witness. They would never make that because the return on that is not ever going to be high enough to move their stock price, right? So they're making Transformers 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or the game equivalent of that, which is not to actually, it's not really true, because the average AAA game right now is still way more interesting than the average Transformers style movie, right? We may get there eventually where things are that vapid, but we're not there today. You know, like, so Call of Duty is one of the most mainstream things, and like, oh, it's the army guy fantasy of running around, but you still do make some interesting choices in that game, right? You still do, they're not choices that are about anything other than like abstract choices about like, what gun do I pick up or something, but they're there. And there is a little bit of a thing, so if you look at the success of a game like PUBG right now, you could look at that as not just people are tired of Call of Duty, but like they're sensing that Call of Duty is a little bit vacuous, and they're looking for something a little bit less vacuous, but that still fits well within that container of, I get to be a dude running around with guns, right? But it disposes with a very important part of the Call of Duty fantasy, which is that I'm the most important person in the world and I can shoot 300,000 people and I'm better than all of them put together, right? Which some years ago people might have told you, yeah, that's just what makes games mainstream. And now apparently maybe it isn't. I mean, we'll see if PUBG, I mean, hopefully everybody's familiar with this game because it's one of the biggest games right now, but It's a multiplayer game where everybody's on an even footing, and so you probably get killed very quickly, especially if you start playing, right? And being good at that game is very difficult, right? So I still have some hope that we're not trending eternally downward, right? That appears to be like a local increase in how good things are in terms of the game being interesting. But no, I mean, so I just saw Blade Runner 2049, right? High budget movie, very visually stylish, right? That's something that movie people are good at when they want to be, right? And they put way more effort than most movies do into like framing shots and coming up with palettes and all these things, generating mood. But it really wasn't about anything, right? All it was about was being Blade Runner 2. And I don't think most people have noticed that, or most people are not wired to notice that maybe. But it also does a pretty good job of camouflaging that. But you put it next to the original movie, which was actually kind of about something, sort of at least, probably. And that's a downhill trend. And that's, you know, people had 30 years or whatever to think about what that sequel would be, and this was the best they came up with. So I think we're doing good compared to movies. But don't expect EA to ever do, or Activision or any of those, Bethesda, to do what the smaller developers are doing. That was too long of an answer.
Well, to explore that point, though, you mentioned how books maybe can explore these kind of deeper topics because they are less costly to put up.
Yes.
Do you feel like maybe some topics are being explored in books or other forms of media that are just not being touched in games, that we haven't gotten to explore yet?
So to make sure I understand the question, it's do I think there are things in other media? Do I think that there are things other media can do that we can't do? Is that the question? Or that we haven't done?
What are...
Or are there things from other media we can import? Or what,
Yeah, the latter. So what are books exploring that video games have not touched yet? Where you talk about maybe how the first-person shooter is slowly moving into maybe, let's say, less vacuous territory, as you described. How can we foresee games to move into territory that has not yet been touched by games? Is there anything that maybe books have done that we haven't explored?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole genre that has thousands of years of development, like, of course, right? But it's hard to say that there's a specific thing that we can pick because, I mean, thousands of years of development. I mean, if you go back to, you know, oral tradition stories, I mean, maybe you could draw the line at written books, but you're still going back. Yeah, you're going back pretty far. It depends. It depends whether you say like printing press or just like dudes writing on scrolls is fine. I don't know. So when you go deep enough into something, so even with games, right? Even with one paltry, measly little game like my last game, The Witness, right? Most of what I thought, and it's very tiny compared to games as a whole, even compared to all the games that came out in 2016 in 1 year, it's almost microscopic. There's so many things produced. And within that one game, most of the things that we thought about when making it, and most of the nuances that like we worked hard on to make sure we're right, nobody really notices, at least not consciously or verbally. Or when reviewers write about the game, the things that they think were important about it were not at all, or bore only tangential resemblance to what we thought were important about it, right? And that's within one game that, granted, we spent like 6 years thinking about. But, you know, there's a whole art of how to make stuff in The Witness, both visually and design-wise and whatever, that we will never come back to again. We built it and we left it. If we were to make more stuff in the world, we would proceed according to this art. But we developed it as far as we needed to, and now we're leaving that and we're going to something else, right? So you extrapolate that to every game, or every book or whatever. There's just tons and tons of stuff. But most of it is kind of encapsulated away in a place that's hard to get. And so, I mean, you could go to books and try to bring things out of there and bring it in, but there's just so much already just by diving more into what you already have in front of you. I think that something like a book or a film that you loved or something like that can provide background influence, like, oh, I became a little bit of a different person because I read or saw that thing, and that influence, that made me interested in certain kinds of things maybe, and then I bring that here. But I think it's a very indirect connections are best. Direct connections don't work that well. So if you try to do something that a book did and try to do it in a game, you get the kind of thing that doesn't play well. If you try to do something from a movie in a game, you're kind of making a bad movie. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, a further answer to that would take like an hour. It's a really...
So as part of the GDC, the Game Developers Conference, you were on this board for the experimental gameplay workshop. I'm sure you saw a lot of crazy ideas. Are there any that you feel haven't reached fruition yet? Any ideas that you feel have not yet been fully explored in games that maybe you look forward to seeing one day?
Basically every game is not fully explored. So you could pick any single thing. Even a game, I mean, you could pick... I don't know. I like Call of Duty is not fully explored, even though they've done like 35 games of it, right? They sort of probably ended up in a rut because they mostly do the same things over and over again. But if you just freshly took to that and said, I'm going to dig into some piece of this and get really interested in it, you could make a game that was substantially different and had its own reason to exist. That becomes its own thing. And that's in some of the most tread out space. So if you then talk about, some prototype that somebody made that didn't really work or whatever, yeah, of course, you could dive into that. It's fractal. You can just dive infinitely into it and find things. It's just not easy because that thing that I mentioned before about being attuned to what's interesting and not interesting or what's working or not working has to be very sensitive in some cases to really see the potential in something, which is why most of this potential does not get explored.
Let's take another question. So the question is, how can we stay nimble and flexible in an industry that moves so fast?
It doesn't move that fast compared to when I started, actually. When I started, we pretty much had to buy a new computer every 4 to 6 months because that's how fast CPUs were getting faster. Whereas now, I mean, I buy a desktop machine like once every few years, which is, and even that is a little bit excessive probably. Things are so much slower. Even, GPUs, they're not getting, I mean, the whole Moore's Law petering out thing is a thing, right? I mean, in the technical sense, Moore's Law is still going because we put more transistors on chips, but like we're not able to use them very well now. So the actual benefit that you get is, it looks like it looks like it's asymptotic to some line that's not quite horizontal, but it has a little bit of a positive slope maybe. So it may seem fast, right, if you weren't around like 20 years ago or something, but the current pace of change is actually not that difficult once you get established in what you're doing. Still, though, on longer project timeframes, there are dangers there. So when we started The Witness, we didn't think it was going to be as long as it was. But we were just like, yeah, I don't exactly know what game consoles are going to be relevant when we finish this. We were thinking about PlayStation 3 when we started because that's what existed. But when that was supplanted by PlayStation 4, we were not surprised. And in fact, that was a relief because then we didn't have to work as hard to target that platform. And really, all of these platforms are converging in a sense, right? So the consoles are a lot more like a PC now in terms of how you program them than they've ever been. Really, the biggest problem actually is software, though, because software has an inertia, right? Which I think is also a little bit part of the question, but it's also a little bit the answer in a way that's a little bit sad, which is just the more code that you have, the more of a problem you have, because the code can't really change, right? And on the one hand, you'd think, oh, well, how do you deal with that, right? How do you adapt into the future with that? But then the answer to that is like, actually, that's part of what's slowing things down and making it manageable, right? Is that everybody has all this code that they can't change that quickly anymore. So you don't have to compete with anybody who's able to very rapidly evolve, because, you know, speaking of AAA companies, they all have, you know, code bases between, I'm going to pull numbers out of my pocket. I'll say like between 3 and 10 million lines of code. 10 is on the high side, but there's probably some games that are higher than that. That's a lot, and it's hard to adapt it. And so when I make a new programming language, for example, one of the things I'm trying to do is remove a lot of the stupid frictions that you get in something like C++ that are unnecessarily preventing you from adapting. But then even then, there's still just going to be this issue that code bases are big. So I don't know. I mean, my approach is that I just try to type fast and try to think of new ways to do things. But it really is much easier than it was. So I wouldn't be worried about that if I were you.
You mentioned that The Witness took 6 years, but it wasn't as long. It was longer than you anticipated. How long did you originally scope that project was going to take?
18 months.
18 months.
18
okay.
months.
Wow.
Yeah.
So.
But
yeah.
the thing that I thought we were going to make in 18 months was like a shadow of what we actually made. It was going to have horrible programmer graphics because I had no reason to believe that I could get a team together that would be able to build a nice 3D thing, because the previous game was 2D, and 2D is a totally different thing, right? And then I just didn't know how big it was going to be, and I didn't know how good I was going to think the puzzles were, and how subtle they were going to be, and how much I was going to get into it. So, you know, there's that. I mean, it also took longer to do individual things than we thought, which is pretty much universally true. Almost nobody comes in under schedule. But part of it was, so this is a thing that happens all the time. It probably will have happened in this class too, is like you get all your ideas together, and you're like, okay, this is what we're doing, and you start building it, and you're like, oh, this is way too much for us to actually do in the time that we have. So you have to like scope the game, which is what you call like cutting out a lot of the things that you wanted to do so that you can save the parts that you can actually do. And we didn't have to do that. In fact, I've never done that. And the only way to avoid doing that is just take more time. So rather than scoping the game, we took more time.
So in this class, students will not have more time.
Yes.
The midterm is basically a prototype for a game they're making.
Yeah.
And then within a period of about 5 weeks, they'll be mapping out milestones and slowly building up to their final project, which will be, you know, something like a small app or game which they could share with the other students.
Yeah.
What is your advice towards planning a project on that scale? What are some of maybe the common pitfalls which you've seen teams run into, and how student teams could avoid that?
Well, so as I've already said, it's a lot harder to do things than you think, even if you already think that, right? So keep that in mind when you're making your schedule. Second part, some things are way more time consuming than others and don't really need to be done so much. So I don't know why. There needs to be like a scientific team studying this, but one of the most time-consuming things in all of game development is like lining up the little UI elements in the right place on the screen and having the right number of pixels between them and something, and like, you know, this bitmap doesn't quite look right or something. That will easily take half the time or more if you let it. And so don't let it. Just like let that stuff, I don't know if you're being graded on that, but if it were up to me, I would say let that stuff be ugly, because once you communicate the information to the player, you probably have enough work to do in other departments, like actually, if it's a 3D game or something, like making navigation through the world work better or something. It's probably more important than like, oh, this thing is 5 pixels too far from this other thing than it should be. Yeah, that stuff takes forever. And every time it happens to me, I don't know why it's happening, but every time.
Let's answer another student question. What was it like to weave narrative into your past tournament?
I am not necessarily a narrative-focused designer, although it's very different for every game, and I'm tossing around a game idea that's very narrative-heavy, right? But we haven't done that yet. So for these past two, it's just that every game's different, and each one wants a different thing. So for Braid, I wanted story elements, like I felt like they were very important, but they're also not linear narrative in any way, right? And that's just what that game really wanted to be. It was part of the very first idea for the very first second, so it's not like I worked on weaving narrative in. It was like the idea was this. For The Witness, the original idea had a much stronger narrative element than the final game ended up having. So there was going to be, there's already audio logs in the game, audio recordings that you find in play, but there were going to be 2 sets of them. One was going to be what's there now, and then the other set was going to be things that were easy to find, placed out like milestones that had like your standard radio play kind of, dramatic dialogue. It was going to be a little more nonlinear, but it was going to be that kind of thing. But then I eventually realized that that was in conflict with the other parts of the game, and I wanted the game to be quieter and to talk less. Because if you're talking a lot, it becomes harder for subtlety, things that require subtlety, to rise up and happen, because you're putting stuff in the player's head all the time. They can't realize things themselves. But also, I realized that this is where searching your own psychology becomes very important. I realized that the real reason why I had started down the road of putting that narrative in that game was because I didn't have enough faith in the rest of the game to stand without the narrative, right? And then, of course, I reevaluated. Once I saw that, I was able to reevaluate it and say, no, really, I want this game without the narrative. And so there's like a tiny sprinkle of actual narrative in the game, almost none. And that's what was right for that game. But like I said, there's another game I'm thinking about now that is full on all narrative all the time. So I think you just have to pay attention to what your particular thing really needs. And that's a bit of a bottom-up approach. So a lot of people, maybe most people, design games in this top-down way, where they say, what makes my game interesting is that it's going to have narrative and gameplay, and they're going to do some kind of shape like this, and that's going to be cool. And it's like, OK, that's a good high-level idea to start with. But reality kind of has to exist at the low level. Like, however that's actually implemented is what matters. That's not the right way to say it, but like, the idea in your head is not ever what somebody's going to play, right? So often what will happen is you get this idea of how the narrative and the gameplay are supposed to happen, and then you try to jam that into the reality of programming and level design and whatever tools you have and stuff, and it doesn't really fit right. It kind of gets broken and bent and whatever, and it becomes an uglier thing than the idea in your head. And so at that point, you have to reassess and say, what's good about this, what's bad about it? Can I restart with what's good and take that to plant a new seed and grow that into something that's different from my original idea, but better, right? And can it be informed by the original idea? So, like I said before, if you had an original idea of having narrative and gameplay in some way, even if you don't totally know it, there's a why there. There's like, that idea interested you for some reason. And often it doesn't have to take that exact shape that you thought of in order to produce that same why later on. And so you maybe have to find a different shape for it. But it very much depends on the specific game. And I wish I could give a formula, but I don't know one yet.
Let's jump to a new question.
The medium itself.
What elements compose an experimental game?
I mean, you know if you're experimenting or not, right? I mean, I mean, if you don't know the answer yet, you're probably experimenting, right? I mean, if you have the blueprint of what you're trying to make, then you're probably not experimenting. And part of not knowing where you're going is you don't know how good it's going to be, right? And then all these previous discussions about reassessing and stuff come in. Because exploring new territory, it puts you in really interesting places, but usually not exactly where you thought you were going. Yeah, I don't know. Is there more? I don't know what else I can say to that question.
Let's jump to the next one.
All right.
So you clearly paid.
What are your favorite games, and how do they inspire you?
Well, so if I'm going to think of like my 3 or 4 favorite games of all time, there was an old, is from the 80s, certainly old for you all, text adventure game called Trinity that was sort of one of my formative influences. I'm fortunate enough to know the author of that game now, Brian Moriarty. He's a professor at a university in Massachusetts. And that was the first game that was clearly an art game to me. I mean, there was all sorts of crazy, wacky stuff in the 80s, but this was the first game I played that was trying to be art in the same way that classic art is acknowledged as art. Like, you know, there's like contemporary and modern and postmodern art and all this stuff where like, there's some kind of modern idea that we've devalued art to the level of junk, or we've elevated junk to the level of art, and so you can just make junk and call it art. And that's awesome, right? And anybody can do it. And there's something true about that, but we've taken it really way too far, right? And so this game back then was, you know, it was art in the way that a painting hanging in the Louvre is art or something. You know, not to make a quality comparison between those two things because they're very different genres, but it was like, oh, you can do this, right? And so people look at Braid and sort of see it as the same kind of thing. Like, oh, this was a game that is clearly, you know, you can argue about how successful or unsuccessful it is, but oh, it's clearly made in that mindset. But, you know, I got that mindset much earlier. And then when I was in college and I should have been working, there was a game called Netrek made by some other students that probably none of you have ever heard of. It was one of the first real multiplayer games. It was like a Star Trek game. They would totally get sued now. It was like a multiplayer Star Trek game where everybody flies a spaceship, and it just. I don't think it necessarily has anything in it that modern games that are well crafted don't necessarily have. So you could think about something like, you know, Dota 2 or League of Legends or something, but it was a space combat team game. I played a lot of Counter-Strike as well. That game taught me a lot of things. I can't say what they are because they're all really subtle. Okay, the big thing about Counter-Strike actually that I think it's become very common in games now, but it's it's worth at least pointing it out, is that some people feel like exploring a design space is about big moves, right? I remember reading some blog post about someone making a first-person shooter. I don't remember when it was. I thought it was John Carmack, but he denies remembering this, so maybe it was someone else. They were developing a game, and they were saying, okay, we want a lot of interesting weapons in this game, so we're going to write out all the properties a weapon can have. So it could be like hit scan, right? It could be instantaneous and happen with a raycast, or it could be a projectile, or it could be like a grenade, right? Or it could just be a droppable thing. So you have a row of all those possibilities, and then you have a column of like, it could do direct damage or damage over time or like whatever, right? And then you just see which boxes in there aren't ticked, and you like design weapons by ticking out those boxes, right? And those are all big moves, like shoot through walls is one of them or something, right? And so Counter-Strike, thinking about it from that perspective, almost all of Counter-Strike is in one of those boxes. There's also grenades, so there's like a second box, right? But you play that game, and the different guns matter super much, tremendously much, and shape the whole thing. And so is really a lesson in subtlety, actually. And it's not a surprise. I mean, there's so many, Army Man have real gun games now that at least you can see that example over and over. But and actually, PUBG is even more that way. So there's all these guns in PUBG that are like the same thing with minor tweaks up or down, but it matters. And you get a feel for how it matters, and that's important.
Let's take another question. Is VR the future, and can that help us push past hardware limitations?
Hardware, like the CPU limitation? No.
Talking about how like the CPUs can do more, but like it doesn't really matter as much. Will
Yeah.
VR be the thing to capitalize on increased performance?
Well, so what I was talking about there was more of a technical only thing, not a design thing. So technically speaking, we're just running out of ideas for how to make software run faster or do more things. That's just how it is. So that aside, that I don't think has very much to do with VR. Talking about design, I think VR is very interesting simply because it brings in a whole level of nuance that wasn't there before. If you look at a standard non-VR computer game right now, you have a very low bandwidth of communication to the game, right? The game can give you all this information, right, with visuals and sounds and all that. But for you telling the game what you want to do, you have like a couple of sticks and a couple of buttons, right, or a mouse. It's like literally, a couple of scalars and a couple of booleans that change over time. It's a very small amount of information, right? Whereas with VR, all of a sudden, okay, I've got live tracking of several things. I've got at least the headset and the handsets and stuff. And you can do really interesting, subtle things with that. Suddenly, you can communicate a lot more effectively with the game. That's kind of stunted right now by the fact that the tracking really isn't that good and all that, but that'll get better, obviously. I don't know. I am interested enough that I have several ideas for games that I would want to make in VR. It's just not. It's not financially feasible right now to do that, but maybe someday.
When you think about all the game ideas you have, do you kind of have some sort of secret playbook or repository where you're dropping all these game ideas? Or what do you do with all the games you don't
I
make?
used to. I had a file with like 120 game ideas in it. But a lot of them are not really good ideas as the foundation of a game. Because they don't answer all the important questions or whatever. A lot of them would be good ideas for something that happens in a game, or maybe like if I were making like an RPG that's a lot like other people's RPG, then it would be cool to have this one thing be different. But I don't want to do that anyway, so it's hard. The real big ideas are more rare. And I don't tend to need to store those anywhere because I only have like a couple more that I haven't done right now. And maybe by the time I do those, I'll have more after that. But I could, yeah.
Okay, we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. Do you see pitfalls that may impede someone from creating games for social change?
Yeah, well, it's a lot like educational games, actually, in that they're hard to make and they usually come out badly. Because, there's something about having that specific agenda that overrides all this other stuff I've been talking about that you need in order to make the game good. So I don't think that it's impossible to do. However, there may be a basic, I haven't thought enough about this, but there may be a basic mathematical problem, right? Let's say you're dating, right? And you want to date someone who's really tall and who's good looking, right? It's a lot easier to find someone who's independently only tall or someone who's independently only good looking, right? If you want to date someone who's tall and good looking, then that's a square, it's a squared problem, right? Where you're squaring some number less than 1. Those numbers get small fast, right? So if you say, I want to make an educational game and it's I want to make something that conveys a very specific social message that I decided a priori successfully, and it's a good game, right? It's the same thing. It's like you've got 2 objectives, and each one is already hard. Each one is already probability less than 1, right? And now you're multiplying them together. And so it becomes small. Now you can do it, you just have to be good. My attitude toward that is I try to get an inkling of what the big idea is from within the game and then see what it can be rather than trying to force it down from above, because that then can reduce those factors that multiply down so small, right? Because one of them is already there to some extent.
Okay, let's keep moving. Yeah. What's the point of games?
I mean, I think you have to answer that individually, right? I mean, so what's the point of life, right? That is, well, you laugh, and it's because in part we're in a society where people are taught not to take that question very seriously. But this is also the source of a lot of our problems, okay? It's actually, if you're at Stanford University and not thinking about that question, when will you ever be thinking about it later in life, right? So it's notoriously difficult for people to agree on an answer to that. But I think it's very important to find an answer to that as an individual. And part of my answer for a long time, especially when I was in school, was I don't know yet, but I want to be on a course to where later I will be in a position to know better, right? And so then I at least had a mission of like going in a certain way. So I think then and that's just for me, right? As a designer then, for games to be important to you, they by necessity have to operate successfully with whatever your picture is of what life's about, or they're going to be meaningless or just a thing that you don't care that much about. So you gotta find that answer, and it may be it's too difficult of a thing for many people at this stage of life to know. But like I was saying before, if you had some idea for a game where a guy wants to jump up and grab a balloon, and something about that picture captivated you in some way, the reasons for that captivation actually run very, very deep, right? And if you're able to figure out why you wanted to make that thing, that could help tell you what the point of games is for you, which may also give you answers to some other questions that you don't have answers to yet.
Okay, that's all the time we have today. Thank you. Let's all thank John for coming to campus.